Hello and welcome to Ink vs. Algorithm, the Writer's Pod. I am thrilled to have on board Mr. Hudson Plumb. He is a poet and a healthcare strategist. He has just published a wonderful book of poetry, The Art of Undoing, with Finishing Line Press. And I just got the alert. You are already a bestseller. Congratulations. Tell us
Thank you,
about
Spitz.
tell us about this amazing book of poetry.
Well, thanks, Spitz, for having me on. This has been a wild ride and a long time coming. Um, I like this quote. It's never too late to be what you might have been, which was misattributed to George Eliot, the famous author of Middlemarch. But it actually, I think, comes from a poem by a woman named Adelaide Proctor, The Ghost in the Picture Room. She wrote this line: "No star is ever lost we once have seen. We always may be what we might have been." It's better if you have a British accent to make it rhyme. But I wrote poetry in my childhood, my teenage years. Won a couple of little local awards. Wrote some poetry again in college. In my 20s, I had a handful of poems published in small publications, and then I got married. My wife Laura and I had our daughter Annalisa, and basically the day she was born, I woke up and realized, I really have to get serious about taking care of some people around here. And I stopped writing. I got a full-time job in healthcare, digital first, and then later strategy. I love my job, but I really put the writing on hold for decades. And I had poems that were kind of rustling around in a drawer for all that time. A few of them complete, others not quite. And many of them were brand new after I started writing again. And it happened while I was housebound during COVID. You can see I've got some plants on the wall. People sometimes compliment me. I'm not a green thumb, but that was part of what was happening during COVID, me going crazy here, sitting in this very chair day after day at work, as you know, on Zoom calls all day long. And I kind of just started thinking, I gotta have something else. I have to have something else. And a light finally went on. You used to write a lot. Why don't you try that? And my wife's Italian, and her brother has some lifelong friends who live in Queens, and one of them is a woman named Maria Tirone, who is an award-winning poet. And I had, through my late 20s and 30s, gone to see her, do some readings, followed her poetry a bit. And I always kind of thought, someday I'll get back to writing and maybe I can do what Maria's doing, actually have books published or something like that. But, 25 years went by and none of that was happening. But during COVID, I thought, what, I'll reach out to Maria. And I did. And she said, well, it's great that you want to start writing again, but it's not a great time. It's not easy right now. A lot of the trends have shifted. A lot of the newer poetry is sort of different. There's different themes now. It's tough. It's tough to get published. But she started giving me some tips and some advice. She shared with me things like there's an online service called Submittable that makes it easy to submit your poems to different publications. So I started using that. And I dusted off a lot of my old poems, and I realized that something that Lawrence Robb had taught me, my poetry professor at Williams College. He really taught me how to read a poem, and through many beautiful examples, why every word kind of can't really be any other. And he wrote a piece that was published in those days about how to read a poem, was the title of it. And in my class at Williams, he had shared one of Frost's poems, stopping by woods on a snowy evening. And there's a line in it. About the woods are lovely, comma, dark and deep. And he stopped on that line and he said, there's that comma, and the fact that there isn't another comma after the word dark, it means it's not a list. It's not lovely, dark, and deep. It's lovely, dark, and deep, which if you read the end of the poem, there's a hint that this person who's just stopping on the road and his horse is kind of stamping its hooves and kind of wondering, why are we stopping in the middle of the woods on a night when you really should be at home? There's a hint, it never comes out directly in the poem, there's a hint that he's contemplating dying or suicide or something. And that line, because the comma is, woods are lovely, dark and deep, gives you the feeling like he's looking out at these woods and contemplating the hereafter or whatever it might be. So when I went back to some of these poems that I'd had lying around, I realized that some of them were okay, but they just needed to be tuned. Like those little things had to be adjusted. So I started doing that, and then I started submitting, and I got rejected over and over and over again. I must have made 50 submissions over a year and a half when I got back into it and got nothing. But I'm a stubborn guy. I hate to lose at anything or to give up at anything. So I just thought, you know what, damn it, I'm going to keep doing this. I don't care. I'm just going to keep after it. And I kept tinkering with the poems and I kept submitting. And then all of a sudden, I think it was starting around 2021, 2022, I had a poem published. I was like, oh, okay, that's one. And then I got another one. And then I got another one. And then a very reputable, great publication, RHINO Poetry, gave me a founder's prize. I was first runner-up for a poem called The Sun. And so I sort of had some momentum. And I kept in touch with Maria, and I started reaching out to a couple other poets. And then and then I submitted the book for The Art of Undoing. So that was kind of the journey, but it's just interesting how things can change when you from a time when nothing's happening to suddenly things kind of pick up.
Well, you shouldn't feel too badly about it. There's the apocryphal story of the poet submitting Shakespeare's sonnets to some of the major publishing houses along the East Coast and being summarily rejected over and over again, and sometimes with elaborate feedback on how they could be improved. And that sense of persistence is just so important. We hear it time and time again that artists aren't so much as discovered as they claw their way to receive the attention that they ostensibly would otherwise deserve, if not for the attention deficit of our society and the judgmentalness of people out of the gate. So kudos to you for persisting. You mentioned that long hiatus. I remember when I found myself an accidental father, and the first thing that I heard from more experienced parents was, your life is now over. And I took that tongue in cheek, but then I discovered the truth of that if you are feeling responsible and you have a family to take care of and a career to engender, that sacrifices do have to be made, and our creative selves are often the first thing that gets tossed with the ballast. We've got to make the money. We've got to feed the minions. Given that hiatus, though, do you feel that some of the experiences that you've picked up in your career, being a family man, having children, that sense of unconditional love, that sense of giving back, have made your poems and your creativity all the more dimensional and emotionally resonant?
Yeah, for sure. I think I mean, being in healthcare, obviously, an industry that's literally about life and death in many ways, you know, and all of the different steps in between. Definitely, I think, enriched my experience in many ways. There's the title poem of the title of the book, "The Art of Undoing," is the last poem of the book, and there is a piece of it in there where I clearly reference the idea that undoing can actually be a really positive thing. You know, to be able to undo the progress of terrible conditions, for example. You know, that's not the exact line, but that's kind of a part of the reference there. And you know, I think the other thing that just strikes me, you know, from COVID to now is I don't know if I'm imagining this, but I think there's signs and signals that poetry is kind of having a resurgence. For example, I was kind of amazed to learn when I was following, you know, the war in Ukraine and really moved by the stories of the people there and just the courage and the ability, the tenacity that these people have to fight and to combat a much bigger nation and with more armaments and everything. Since Russia launched its invasion in 2022, poetry in Ukraine has exploded. It's surged in books, read aloud, even while they're being bombed, shared by tens of thousands online, becoming kind of both an outlet and a touchstone for the will of the people and for the courage and for all different kinds of things there. And, you know, there's a lot going on in the world, but it feels like, for me, you know, people come to poetry for a lot of reasons, but it seems to me, in my experience anyway, that we're drawn to it in moments of heightened experience, moments of wonder, moments of crisis, like what I was just talking about. So maybe people feel that poetry is relevant again. And it's also relevant because it's, you and I were talking about this before, it's one of the greatest short forms of art that's ever been invented. And I like the fact that poets used to call their poems songs. There's a great poem that has a refrain over and over: "Sweet Thames, run softly till I end my song." And I think it's appropriate because poems have their own music. And obviously, some of the greatest musicians are poets. I mean, I love, you know, of course, Dylan is a bona fide poet for sure, one of the greatest ever. So that's motivating. But, you know, the thing that's funny about poetry, and this is also why I think my own story is just kind of interesting, how tiny changes can make all the difference. For me, writing poetry is very tricky. It's kind of like, the analogy I use is like, it's kind of like assembling a watch in the dark, blindfolded, trying to feel your way along and find what fits. And until all the parts are in the right place, the poem doesn't tick and it doesn't tell time. So, you know, there's a moment when a poem suddenly starts to kind of tick and you can just feel the difference. The before, it's like close, but nothing's happening yet. And then suddenly it's like, oh, that one word, now the second hand's moving, it's alive. So, you know, it's kind of like that, but it can be frustrating too, because I've had poems that I've loved or thought I loved for many years, but they're always kind of like, it's just not quite there yet. And weirdly, letting a poem sit in a drawer, or, you know, on the digital version of a drawer for a while, even years, can actually help. What I've noticed, Spitz, about my own writing, and you may feel the same about yours, is that there's a difference between what you think you've written and what you've actually written in terms of how another person's going to read it. Because we both have in our mind what we intend, and then we think the words are expressing that. But when you look at it in the cold light of the morning, or, you know, days or years after, you can suddenly see, oh, it's not working. it's not what I thought it was. I thought I meant this, but it's actually more like this. So I've actually found it beneficial sometimes to leave a poem alone for weeks, months, even years, come back to it and suddenly realize what it was that wasn't quite clicking. And I've also gotten better at noticing when some part of me is kind of has a tiny bit of a hint that there's something wrong. Years ago, I think I would fool myself and think, no, it's good, it's great, I love it. But I think I've gotten to a point now where I kind of have a sense like, yeah, it's not quite there. So I better put that over here for a while, and I'll come back when I can read it dispassionately and see, okay, this is where I've got to fix it. And part of it is also that, you know, we work hard, right? Writers work hard to try to make something work. It's a lot of effort. And it can be quite depressing to think you've got to tear up an entire section and start over, you know? So it's almost easier sometimes to keep kidding yourself, like, no, it's good, it's fine, you know? And then, but I think I've gotten a little bit better now at being discontent or being willing to admit to myself that I'm not quite content with it. Whereas in the past, I might have been more more willing to say that I was satisfied.
Yeah, that highlights many things, especially this difference and at the same time similarity of poetry in our modern age, where we're inundated by content, streams of digital content, and people are seeking brevity. Their attention spans are limited, and to your point, poetry lends itself very well to shorter form expression. But you're also highlighting a key difference, which is the density, the emotional resonance, the depth, the craftsmanship of good poetry, and how people are seeking clarity, and yet the ambiguity of poetry lends its intense power and depth. So it's balancing these two forms. And also, to your point, going back to the Epic of Gilgamesh, Homer, the Iliad, and the Odyssey, poetry is the archetypal form of not only storytelling, but of writing itself. It's lyrical, it's often metered or structured, and it's very much along the lines of what you're describing: precision with emotion, storytelling with action, but with that veneer of ambiguity to get the listener directly involved. I love poetry for all these reasons, and your book brings all this to bear. You cover many different types of form. Your poems are lively and creative on the page. You explore different types of expression. You have what could be called a confessional autobiographical style. Clearly, the narrator seems to be you at times. Other times, it's some other party. And again, the ambiguity feeds into the interest that the reader has to find out who is doing the narration, what the impact is. And sometimes the stakes are life and death, just like your career. You bring up some heavy situations and topics, and sometimes in an unexpected and surprising way throughout the many poems in the book. So I appreciate the advanced screening, and I found it creative, emotionally resonant, and expertly crafted. There's a feeling and a flavor of language which is seamlessly entwined with the intent and action. So kudos to you from this one bald guy writer on the other coast of the United States. And And I can maybe reinforce my own enthusiasm with a quote, if you don't mind me reading it. It's from Lawrence Robb. He's the author of Mistaking Each Other for Ghosts, which has its own credibility, long listed for the National Book Award, named one of the best poetry books of 2015 by the New York Times. And he got a peek at the art of undoing. And what he wrote was this: loss, the undoing of things, is a compelling central concern in Hudson Plumb's fine collection of poems. But his title also suggests restoration and invention, the art of poetry. Although things come apart, these poems remain committed to the richness and pleasures of accumulation. There is so much to see in the world. If the news seems hopeless, quote, and time no longer stretches its pretty ribbon before us, unquote, as Plum writes in one particularly lovely poem, we still linger and listen. And when we look up, our eyes are, quote, focused on clouds passing between the fingers of a eucalyptus tree. A nice poetic homage to your poetry.
Yeah. I admire Larry Robb so much, and he taught me so well. Like I said, how to read a poem. It was the pillar or the foundation that later helped me learn how to write a poem. And having your ear out for that, like he did a great exercise, Spitz, that you would have gotten a kick out of. In his poetry class at Williams College, he would take selections of poems, various old and new poems, and he'd pull out a line or two and he'd take a couple words out, and he'd ask the class to fill in what would work there, or what we thought the poet might have written. And it was such a fantastic exercise, because try as you might, it was very hard to put anything into those lines that would really resonate even 1,000th as well as what the poet had put in there. So, like, for example, this is one I'll never forget. He said there was a line, the pears fatten like, and we had to fill that in. The pears fatten like what? And I don't know if you want to give it a go, but I'll tell you what Sylvia Plath wrote. Little Buddhas, the pears fatten like little Buddhas, and it just suddenly, yes, of course.
The morphology of the fruit with the little Buddhas with their big old booties.
Yeah, exactly. So
that's actually classic Sylvia too, with that irreverent, almost childish humor and the playfulness with the language. That's great.
Yeah. So those kinds of things. But like I said, in my 20s, I had a few poems published. I actually sent some to Larry. He wrote some critiques of them. I wasn't thrilled to read that, he had trouble with some of my poems, right? So I guess I had to let things simmer a long time. I had to let it kind of put it on the back burner, let it simmer, and then many years later come back and sort of have a round two, as it were.
What was your writing process? Because you are still paying the bills and holding it together. Actually, quite accomplished career. We were colleagues for a while. We attended many of the same conferences. We won some of the same awards, and we crossed paths. I have committed more and more time to my creativity, much at the expense of my balance sheet. But to your point, my kids have grown to the point of independence, and I feel that I've been able to shift gears, whether voluntarily or instinctively, again, to your point, where something was missing. and I can't do anything else but write at this point while haphazardly paying the bills. But it seems like you've been an upstart citizen and career focused. How have you been able to juggle? I'm sure many of our listeners would like to hear how you have maintained ostensibly a much healthier work-life balance than your humble podcaster here has been able to do.
Yeah. Well, I think that having my children, grown and on their own now, means weekends are, with kids, weekends are the kids. That's what it's soccer practice, or it's whatever it
Yeah.
might be, gymnastics or whatever's going on. So yeah, those days are behind me now. So I during the week I really don't write much creatively. My work is demanding. I mean, as you know, Spitz. But on the weekends, I'll pour several hours in on usually both days, Saturday and Sunday. And the other thing is, I don't think quantity by itself is the major requirement, because, like I said, you almost have to let it breathe in between. I honestly, I'll write, intensely for an hour or two, and then take a break and maybe do a little bit more, and then you got to let the poem rest and come back to it with fresh eyes and go, okay, this is. And I find that um, I write in sort of intense sprints, and then I'm kind of done for the day. I really can't do it for hours and hours and hours. I just wrote a new poem, um, which I'm excited about. It's kind of it's called America Continued, picking up on an Allen Ginsberg poem called America that he wrote, decades ago. It's kind of my own take on it. But I found that I really had to just keep tackling it in short sprints, like a half hour, and then I'd stop, and then another half hour or another hour. So I think I'm just not the most I'm not the most prolific writer, though, for that reason.
Well, it's quality over quantity, as you mentioned. And I think you're blessed in choosing a modality, specifically poetry, where this kind of agility and laser focus lends itself perfectly to the craft itself. I think I got the worst of both worlds, where my latest book was an obsessive focus on individual poems comprising an entire novel. So I obsessed over 3-line paragraphs, which turned it, in a sense, into
Yeah,
lyric poetry, and it's 120,000 words. So I had the ridiculous laser focus, but with volume. And this might explain the problems I'm having with my personal balance sheet in terms of the sheer energy that it takes. But it's great that you're able to find that balance, and in this sense, nothing's missing. Where, to your point, I've heard this said from many artists and creative people. Mathematicians are similar. Some of the most renowned mathematicians can really only sustain their concentration for a couple hours at a time, and then they're done for the day. And Hemingway famously got up at 5 in the morning and wrote until maybe 10 o'clock, and he was done for the day. That was it. So being smart, working smarter, not harder, and appreciating that these creative juices are selective, moody, and you don't need to
yeah,
burn yourself out. You don't need to crank out hundreds of thousands of words to accomplish what you're trying to do, when you have sensitivity to the craft and confidence in your own ability.
yeah, yeah. No, I think intense sprints works for me. And so yeah, so I mean, a few hours each weekend is really that's what I can do right now. I mean, I suppose, someday in the future, if I retire from my healthcare job, which I'm not planning to do anytime soon, maybe I would have more, put more into it. But for now, that's what kind of works for me. Is I guess I'm a weekend warrior on the writing front.
Well, that's terrific, and that work-life balance and that work-life creativity balance, I think, is what it's all about. And again, I think the output speaks for itself. I found your book wonderful and engaging, and to me, very creative. Would you mind reading a few selections from? I have my own personal favorites, but I'll of course allow the poet to pick and choose what works best for you and your
Yeah,
publisher.
absolutely. So, yeah, I got a couple of poems I could read. Why don't I start with I'll start with a poem that takes place off the coast of Vancouver Island in British Columbia. It's called Vancouver Island Whale Watch.
Great.
A June wind wrinkles the ocean's dark linen. Beneath the restless covering move shadowy fins. Moon jellies open and close their pale umbrellas, and whales rise and fall in giant geometry. In the distance, always in the distance. When we draw near the coast, a two-eyed stingray flaps its noiseless wings, and there, hovering in midair, an osprey stands clutching silver, its fierce, sad cry piercing the heart. The trail of orca spouts gone cold, we turn into a cove, spy a ledge full of bowing seals, and cormorants hop diving below surface for minutes at a time, then popping up with sideways prizes. At last, with the sun behind us, our watch for elusive whales nearly over, crossing the glassy water, our vessel unzips the perfect surface of the bay, and suddenly, off the starboard bow, a mother humpback and her calf roll over, nearly grazing the hull, her giant spout like a sigh of relief. So that's that one.
Very nice. Can you tell us a little bit about it? Can you tell us, now that we've got the author and you read a lovely poem in a lovely way, there seems to be a personal connection to some of this experience. Do you want to share anything? Or?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, Spitz. I love animals and nature, and I just find it endlessly fascinating. And this poem is based on some real experience in Vancouver Island. One whale watch that was completely sans whales. My wife and I went on two whale watches. The first one, there were no whales to be found, and then the second time there were. So this poem kind of combines like multiple experiences with that. But I thought the thing that the poem traces, which was also kind of real experience, was in the hunt for the whales, all this other marine life is all around you. These ospreys, the cormorants, the seals, all of this other life. And then, just learning about, we're trying to find orcas at the time, and learning about that there's three different types of orcas. There's a breed that only hunts for salmon, for fish, and then there's others that hunt for seals, and then there's a third that are completely ocean going and almost never come into shore. So wild stuff like that. But the orcas that hunt for salmon use echolocation to find them. They're kind of like sonar under the water to see where the schools are. But they can't use that for seals because seals are mammals, and they'll detect they're being hunted. Isn't that wild? So yeah, I just find this stuff very fascinating.
The other observation that I could just offer, being a doting reader, is placement of the poems. So they're obviously in order. The book is divided into three main sections, and this sojourn into the beauty of nature is nestled into several other poems that are very, very different in style and emotional resonance. Can you tell us a little bit about how you thought of these three main sections and the individual placements and sequence of the poems?
Yeah, that's cool that you touched on that, Spitz, because yeah, the poem I read, I jumped straight into the third section. But yeah, the first section. So there's three sections, and there's lovely cover art and the section art by Anson Jones, who is a multi-talented artist in her own right. She's a musician and a visual artist, but I did intend for it to progress, and a lot of the first section are kind of older poems and sort of earlier experiences, somewhat. The middle is more of, life in New York. A kind of a section of there's a poem that's set in Hell's Kitchen. There's other poems that are street life. So there's that, and then the third section is where we start to head towards the art of undoing, and just my take on, I guess, themes of loss, renewal. Where is it? Where is it all going? And this concept of undoing, which I kind of became fascinated about, both as the meaning of to actually undo something, but also a meaning related to refraining from doing something, or the art of kind of, not to get too philosophical about it, but I think that there's some meditation gurus who've talked about becoming like an unfinished stone, or just to be kind of to lose some of the sophistication and to undo that and to become more simpler.
Yeah, and maybe clear the palette, if you will, tabula rasa, so that you could be reborn, reinvented, go through that catharsis, and when you undo, you're ready to do something new. That's the feeling I got from many of your poems, that it wasn't an invitation to end stuff, but an invitation to reboot and to recharge. And in a sense, that's what you've done with your writing.
Yeah, it's true. And there are losses along the way. There's pain, there's suffering, but then there's renewal, and then there's rekindling. So yeah, it's a cycle. And yeah, try to look for that, because there are terrible things that happen in our world, but you can't dwell. You can't stay with that. And that's the kind of, I guess, the beauty of life, is that every moment just comes one after the other, and it, we're kind of in this river that's moving along, and we just have to keep experiencing everything that's coming ahead.
That's my personal favorite aspect of the poetry in this volume, is how you've turned pain and ugliness into beauty at various points in your writing. To me, that really hit home, and that, as a writer, I can appreciate that is very, very hard to do.
I'll read, Spitz, if you like. I'll read two more poems, and then we can see if there's more to chat about. But these two go into the first section. So when I was a young boy, our family moved to Mendoza, Argentina, and flying back to the U.S. every summer, I was fascinated by how vast the world looked from the plane, and how small the people in the building seemed as we landed. This poem's called The Largest Thing. In Argentina, when I was 5, my father died against the trunk of a tree, and my mother took long walks on the beach, and I had dreams that he had come to look at me with his arms at his sides and his back resting on the ceiling. And from then on, it seemed that the lower half of the world was dead, and only the upper half lived on, pretending health. And I grew up happily with a sunny face and hands flinging something invisible at the sky. And only when I was 8, listening to my mother read a story, did I remember the largest thing I knew. For I knew that pain was no larger than the cut, and love ambled around the house like a pet, and melancholy was a stone I fingered by myself, but only loss was as large as a word I couldn't remember, as large as space. The story she read was about a raccoon clubbed down in the snow by a man. For days I ate my meals with little black hands.
That's strong.
And I'll read one last poem.
Yeah.
This was published in RHINO Poetry. For most of my life, my family has spent time together every year at a remote fishing cabin on the Klamath River in Northern California. About a quarter mile downstream, the river makes a sharp dogleg turn where the water piles up against the rocks. And this poem is called The Sun. The divers pulled a young man out of the river, a boy of 18. His father stood by. He was an excellent swimmer, they said. He must have hit a rock or got caught on a snag somehow. I stepped closer. His skin was stained blue in patches and pale as moonlight everywhere else. Jesus, someone said. A sudden breeze picked up from the far side, blowing back the grasses like the flames on a birthday cake. Right then, it was so quiet you could hear trout starting to rise, watch their rings spreading out from the underside. In low voices, we talked among ourselves about how unlucky it was, and now and then the police radio blared out its gravelly dialogue with feedback punctuating the voices before and after. The father, staring red-eyed across the river, pursed his lips and stood still as a heron, his eyes on the swirling eddy.
Yeah, those were actually a couple of my favorites. As I was intimating earlier, the juxtaposition with the whale watching, the natural beauty, in relation to some arduous, roiling emotional trauma, both trauma that you presumably endured, and by projection another parent is strong, very, very powerful. So good stuff, Hudson.
Thanks for letting me share all of this. Yeah.
Yeah, and as I mentioned, the folks at Finishing Line are already celebrating your book sales, so that must feel good. That within this genre and for this publisher, you're clearly getting some notice and getting some readership. How much of that is your own hustle, and how much of it is the momentum of writing a book like this in 2025?
Well, Finishing Line Press has been great. They have been coaching me, helping me, guiding me on how to get the word out. They post stuff on social media. I'm not a very talented social media maven. I'm sure you're 1,000 times more adept. But my daughter Annalisa has been helping me. So I still fumble to do an Instagram story, but I get some stuff out there, and it's nice to have friends and family. And my wife and I and my daughter orchestrated a reading here in New York City at a church, the Church of the Holy Trinity, which is right down the street on 88th Street, and we had 75 people come, and it was a thrill to just have so many old friends. My first real boss in healthcare. My first supervisor in healthcare, Larry Starr, who I emulate and admire so much. Hadn't seen him in at least 10 years, maybe longer. And he came, and it was sort of like it was a tiny bit of a this is your life kind of moment. Like, wait, you're my first boss from my first job. And then some people I worked in restaurants downtown when I first came to New York back in the 80s. And then this friend, all these pieces of my life sort of showing up there. So that was very gratifying to have that. And
so it was a
to be able to
Hudson
share it.
party, and it was a promo for your book too, right? So you were talking about your
Yeah,
book, and it's
exactly.
kind of a launch with friends and family, and that's a terrific takeaway. Many of our listeners are fledgling writers, indie writers, and the recurring theme here, expressed by yourself, other writers, is you can't just hunker down and create something phenomenal and then release it to the world and move on. You need to connect with people and create a sense of
Mm-hmm.
community any which way you can, so that your content is not only noticed, but becomes a part of something bigger than yourself and ultimately benefits those on the receiving end, not just the creating end. So kudos to you. Now that you've cracked this later life nut of tapping into your inchoate and now expressive creativity, what's next? Are you already noodling with more poems for another anthology? Are you even thinking about an audiobook perhaps to read these aloud?
I've tackled a number of poems that I think kind of are much more current day. The effect of digital on our lives. The America Continued poem really digs into that. I'm excited about that poem and a couple of others like that. The other thing that is in my mind, you ever hear of the book Spoon River Anthology?
Well, of course. That was a big
It,
hit. Yeah.
yeah, it's a collection of monologues, and it was used in acting classes. I took an acting class where the teacher used that book for folks to practice with the monologues, because each of the poems is essentially the voice or the narrative of a single person in the town. They're all deceased, so these are all essentially ghostly poems from the afterlife. But what I like about it is I don't think of myself as a very clever poet. Like, there are some poets who are very clever and just amazingly have incredible dexterity with words and things. Like Shakespeare, for example, is a perfect example of that. But what I think I have going for me is I have a pretty good ear for dialogue and for voice, like and some of my poems have like one of the poems in the book Crabs and Chaos is based on an artist named Mary Atkins. I might be butchering her last name, Mary Atkins, who learned how to grow hermit crabs in captivity, and it had never really been done successfully. But I tried to kind of capture her voice in that poem. And so I think going forward, I want to do more of that. Like the America poem sort of attempts that. And then that kind of excites me to to work with the narrative of different characters that I encounter or imagine, and try to really maybe even have a collection that's kind of like my version of Spoon River, something like that.
That's great. Your crab poem was even inspired by a Radiolab podcast, you point out. So that's very contemporary and fun and multimodal, which is just a terrific use of different media. My personal favorite, if I can call it out, is In the Sky of the Mind. If we
Oh,
could
cool.
mention
You like
that.
that one?
I like that one a
Yeah.
lot. And I'm a huge fan of concrete poetry, where the words on the page create either images or simply by the form of their layout convey another dimension of meaning. And in this poem, you have two parallel poems in a sense, and you could read them individually, left column and right column. You could go from left to right across the two columns. And I love that iterative nature where, depending on the choice made by the reader, it becomes a very, very different experience. So that kind of playfulness with layout, you have several poems where you play with layout on the page. And I thought that added, again, a layer of meaning. Semantics through syntax is something that I find fascinating. And I just particularly appreciated your creativity when it came to just laying out the words, not just sounding them out, to your point, reading them out loud, polishing them and refining them, but how they actually appear to the reader and thereby changing the meaning and the emotional resonance of the poems themselves. I think that was particularly masterful.
Yeah, that's cool. I'm glad you liked that poem. That one, that was definitely a little bit of an outlier for me at the time. I think now, looking back on it, I'm more comfortable. Like the America poem, when you read that one, um, has some of that. Not quite the same, but yeah, at the time that was kind of a departure for me. So I'm glad that resonated for you.
Yeah, they say that great artists, you swim out from the shore, and as long as your feet aren't entirely touching the bottom, you're in a good place to force yourself, in a sense, to take a few risks, try something new. And if you aren't a little bit uncomfortable, then you haven't gone out far enough.
Well said. Well said. I was just going to say that poem you mentioned, In the Sky of the Mind, there's another poem that has sort of not the same, but a similar kind of, I guess, unusual structure. Seymour's Fat Lady in New York.
Yeah, I love that one too. Yeah, that's in the middle section, right? Section 2.
Right. Section 2. Well, thank you for having me, Spitz.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. Thank you for sharing your creativity and your poetry with the world. On behalf of myself and all our listeners, we wish you luck. I am going to place links to getting your book, and I'll share your bio and info, and there'll be an opportunity for listeners to even reach out if they want to, with a link to send me a text, and I can forward to you. Like, comment, share. The audio version will be everywhere on Spotify, iHeartRadio, Apple Podcasts, and on YouTube I'll post our video so you can see Hudson reading his goodies. And we'll be sharing clips as well. Thank you so much, Hudson. Best of wishes, best of luck to you in your evolving poetic career. So hopefully you can devote even more time and energy to it. Thanks so much.